The morning sun had barely touched the golden spires of the royal palace when Margaret arrived at the servants' entrance. Her hands were rough from years of washing dishes and scrubbing floors, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had worked in the palace kitchens for 15 years, ever since her husband died and left her with 2 young children to feed. The pay was modest, but it was steady, and that meant everything to a widow trying to survive in the capital city. Margaret pushed through the heavy wooden door and made her way down the familiar stone corridor. The smell of fresh bread was already wafting from the ovens, and she could hear the clatter of pots and pans as the morning shift began their preparations. She tied her worn apron around her waist and got to work, her movements automatic after so many years of the same routine. The palace was buzzing with unusual energy that morning. Princess Isabella was scheduled to make an appearance in the main courtyard to greet visiting dignitaries from a neighboring kingdom. Everyone knew the princess was particular about everything being perfect. The floors had to shine like mirrors, the silverware had to gleam, and the servants had to be invisible yet always present when needed. Margaret had seen the princess from a distance many times over the years. Isabella was beautiful. There was no denying that, with her flowing dark hair and elegant gowns that probably cost more than Margaret would earn in a lifetime. But beauty alone did not make a person kind, and Margaret had heard enough whispered stories from other servants to know that the princess had a sharp tongue and little patience for those she considered beneath her. As the morning wore on, Margaret finished her duties in the kitchen and was assigned to help with the final preparations in the courtyard. She grabbed a bucket of soapy water and a brush, making her way through the maze of hallways that connected the working areas of the palace to the grand public spaces. The contrast was always jarring. Back in the kitchens, everything was practical and worn. But here, in the parts of the palace where royalty walked, everything sparkled with wealth and privilege. Margaret was on her knees, scrubbing the base of a marble column, when she heard the click of expensive shoes on the polished floor. She glanced up and immediately recognized Princess Isabella approaching with 2 of her ladies in waiting. Margaret quickly looked back down, focusing on her work. Servants were taught never to make direct eye contact with royalty unless spoken to first. The princess swept past, her perfume leaving a trail of roses and lavender in the air. Margaret continued scrubbing, thinking the moment had passed without incident. But then she heard the princess stop and turn around. Margaret's heart sank. She knew that tone, that pause that meant something had caught the princess's attention. "You there!" Princess Isabella's voice rang out, sharp and clear. The servant scrubbing the floor. Margaret set down her brush and stood up slowly, keeping her eyes lowered respectfully. "Yes, Your Highness?" "Look at the water in your bucket," the princess said, her voice dripping with disgust. "It's filthy. You're not cleaning the marble, you're smearing dirt across it. Are you incompetent, or do you simply not care about the appearance of my palace?" Margaret felt her face grow hot. She looked at the bucket. The water was dirty, yes, but only because she had already cleaned 3 other columns with it. She had planned to get fresh water before starting the 4th, but the princess had appeared before she could do so. Margaret opened her mouth to explain, but the words died in her throat. Servants did not make excuses to royalty. "I apologize, Your Highness," Margaret said quietly. "I will fetch fresh water immediately." "You will do more than that," Princess Isabella continued, stepping closer. Her ladies in waiting stood behind her, their faces carefully neutral. "You will clean every column in this courtyard again with fresh water each time. And you will do it properly, or you will find yourself looking for work elsewhere. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Highness," Margaret whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the bucket handle. The princess started to turn away, but then she paused and looked back at Margaret with cold eyes. "How long have you worked here?" 15 years, Your Highness." 15 years, and you still cannot perform a simple task correctly. The princess shook her head. Perhaps it is time this palace employed servants with higher standards. People who take pride in their work rather than treating it as mere drudgery. Something inside Margaret cracked at those words. 15 years of waking up before dawn, of missing her children's school events because she had to work, of aching knees and rough hands, of swallowing her pride day after day. 15 years of doing her best with what little she had, all dismissed in a single cruel sentence. "With respect, Your Highness," Margaret heard herself saying, her voice stronger than she expected. "I do take pride in my work. I have supported my family for 15 years through this job. I may not wear silk dresses or live in grand rooms, but I work hard every single day. Perhaps if those of us who actually do the work were given adequate supplies and realistic expectations, everything would shine even brighter than it already does. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Margaret realized what she had just done, and terror flooded through her. She had talked back to the princess. She had contradicted royalty in front of witnesses. This was not just grounds for dismissal. In some cases, it could mean far worse. Princess Isabella's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. Her eyes widened in disbelief that a mere servant would dare speak to her in such a manner. The ladies in waiting gasped, their hands flying to their mouths. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire courtyard seemed frozen in time. Then the princess found her voice. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You insignificant, ungrateful wretch. Guards, come here at once." Heavy footsteps echoed across the courtyard as 2 palace guards came running. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She had ruined everything. Her job was gone, certainly. But what would happen to her children? Who would feed them, keep a roof over their heads? Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would face whatever came with dignity, even if she had just destroyed her entire life with a moment of foolish pride. The guards arrived, their armor gleaming in the morning sun. One of them was older, with gray threaded through his dark hair and kind lines around his eyes. The other was younger, stern-faced and rigid with military discipline. Both of them looked at the scene before them, trying to understand what had happened. Princess Isabella pointed a trembling finger at Margaret. "This servant has insulted me. She has spoken to me with complete disrespect and insubordination. I want her removed from the palace grounds immediately, and blacklisted from ever working in any royal household again." "See to it at once." The younger guard moved forward immediately, reaching for Margaret's arm, but the older guard held up a hand, stopping his companion. He looked at Margaret, then at the princess, then at the dirty water in the bucket and the freshly cleaned columns behind them. His expression was thoughtful, calculating, as though he was putting together pieces of a puzzle that others could not see. "Your Highness," the older guard said carefully, "might I ask what exactly the servant said to you?" Princess Isabella looked at the guard as if he had lost his mind. Nobody questioned her when she gave an order, least of all palace guards whose job was to follow commands without hesitation. Her face flushed an even deeper shade of red, and her voice came out sharp enough to cut glass. "What does it matter what she said? She spoke to me with disrespect, and that is all you need to know. Captain." The princess emphasized his rank as though reminding him of his place in the palace hierarchy. Captain Thomas had served in the Royal Guard for 23 years. He had protected 3 generations of the royal family, fought in 2 wars, and earned more medals than he had space to display them. He was not easily intimidated, not even by an angry princess. He kept his voice calm and respectful, but there was steel underneath the courtesy. "Your Highness, palace protocol requires that I understand the nature of any incident before taking action, especially one that involves permanent dismissal and blacklisting. If this servant has truly committed an offense worthy of such punishment, then I must document it properly for the royal records. I simply need to know her exact words." The princess opened her mouth to argue, but Captain Thomas had invoked protocol, and even she could not simply dismiss that. Royal protocols existed for reasons, built up over centuries to prevent chaos and ensure fair treatment, even in a hierarchical system. She crossed her arms and spoke through clenched teeth. She dared to suggest that I do not provide adequate supplies or reasonable expectations to the palace staff. She implied that I am somehow at fault for her poor performance. She spoke as though we were equals rather than recognizing her proper place. The princess's voice rose with each sentence. "Is that sufficient for your precious documentation, Captain?" Captain Thomas turned to Margaret, who stood there trembling, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the ground. She looked like a woman standing before an execution, resigned to her fate but trying desperately to maintain what little dignity she had left. "Is this true?" Captain Thomas asked her gently. "Did you say these things to Her Highness?" Margaret swallowed hard. There was no point in lying. Too many people had witnessed what happened, and dishonesty would only make things worse if that was even possible. She nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I said that I take pride in my work, and that I have supported my family through this job for 15 years. I said that perhaps if we had better supplies and realistic expectations, everything would be even better. I should not have spoken. It was not my place. I accept whatever punishment is decided. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone in the courtyard heard every word. The younger guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to simply grab Margaret and drag her away so this uncomfortable situation would end. But Captain Thomas held up his hand again, keeping everyone in place. "Your Highness," the captain said, turning back to Princess Isabella, "with your permission, I would like to examine the situation more closely before proceeding." "There is nothing to examine." The princess's patience was clearly wearing thin. "I gave you an order, Captain. Are you refusing to follow it?" "Not at all, Your Highness, but I believe we may be dealing with a misunderstanding rather than genuine insubordination." Captain Thomas walked over to the columns that Margaret had been cleaning. He ran his finger along the marble, examining the surface carefully. Then he looked into Margaret's bucket, noting the dirty water. He walked further down the courtyard and examined the other columns, the ones Margaret had already cleaned earlier that morning. The captain came back and stood between the princess and the servant, a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and wisdom. "Your Highness, I have examined the evidence. 3 columns in this courtyard are spotlessly clean, clearly washed with fresh water by someone who takes great care in their work. The 4th column, which this servant was working on when you arrived, shows signs that she was using dirty water from previous cleaning. This suggests she was not being careless, but rather working efficiently by cleaning multiple columns before changing her water." Princess Isabella's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you suggesting that I was wrong, Captain?" "I am suggesting that what appeared to be poor work was actually good work interrupted at an unfortunate moment," Captain Thomas replied carefully. "As for the servant's words, while they may have been spoken above her station, they were not disrespectful in content. She did not insult Your Highness personally. She simply stated that she takes pride in her work and explained the challenges she faces. Perhaps her delivery was not as polished as it should have been, but I do not believe her intent was to show disrespect." The courtyard was silent. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how the princess would react. Margaret could not believe what she was hearing. The captain was defending her, putting his own position at risk by contradicting the princess. Nobody did that. Nobody stood up for a lowly servant against royalty. It simply did not happen. But Princess Isabella was not accustomed to being contradicted, and she was certainly not ready to admit she might have been hasty in her judgment. Her voice came out cold and sharp. "Captain Thomas, you seem to have forgotten your place. You are a guard, not an advisor to the royal family. Your job is to protect us and follow our commands, not to lecture us on fairness or question our decisions. Now remove this servant from the palace grounds before I decide that you need to be removed as well." Something changed in Captain Thomas's expression. His jaw tightened and his eyes took on a distant look, as though he was remembering something from long ago. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow more powerful than before. "Your Highness, do you remember the winter you turned 7 years old?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, completely unconnected to anything that had been discussed. Princess Isabella blinked in confusion, thrown off balance by the unexpected change in subject. "What does that have to do with anything?" she demanded. "That winter there was a terrible storm," Captain Thomas continued, ignoring her question. "The palace was cut off from the city for 3 days. Do you remember what happened during that storm?" The princess stared at him, and slowly something flickered in her eyes, a memory long buried beginning to surface. Her angry expression wavered, replaced by uncertainty. "I remember the storm," she said slowly, "but I do not see what that has to do with this situation." "During that storm you were playing in the upper gallery," Captain Thomas went on, his voice steady and calm. "You were not supposed to be there, but you were a curious child who did not always follow the rules. The storm had damaged some of the structure, and you ventured too close to a window. The frame gave way and you fell." Margaret watched as the color drained from Princess Isabella's face. The ladies in waiting looked at each other in confusion, clearly not knowing this story. The younger guard stood at attention, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes showed his curiosity. "You fell 2 stories, Captain Thomas said. "You would have died on the stone courtyard below, but someone caught you." "Do you remember who?" Princess Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. "A servant. One of the kitchen servants caught me. Her name was Anne. Captain Thomas said. "She was carrying a basket of bread for the evening meal when she saw you fall. She dropped everything and ran to catch you. She broke both her arms in the process, but she saved your life. Do you remember what happened to her after that?" The princess said nothing, but tears had begun to form in her eyes. Captain Thomas pressed on, his voice still gentle but relentless. "Your father, the king, was so grateful that he offered her a reward. He offered her gold, a position in the palace with better pay, anything she wanted. But Anne refused everything. She said she was just doing what any decent person would do, and all she wanted was to keep her job in the kitchen so she could continue supporting her daughter." "Do you remember her daughter's name, Your Highness?" Princess Isabella's hands were shaking now. She looked at Margaret, really looked at her for the first time, seeing past the worn apron and the rough hands to the person underneath. "Her daughter's name," Captain Thomas said quietly, "was Margaret." The silence that fell over the courtyard was deafening. Margaret felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She stared at Captain Thomas, then at the princess, her mind racing to process what had just been revealed. Her mother had never told her the full story. Anne had always been private about her time in the palace, saying only that she had worked hard and been treated fairly, and that Margaret should do the same if she ever found work there. Princess Isabella took a step back, her hand rising to her throat. The anger had completely drained from her face, replaced by shock and something that looked like shame. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered to each other behind their hands, clearly stunned by this revelation. "I did not know," Princess Isabella said, her voice shaking. "I did not know that she was Anne's daughter." "How could you know?" Captain Thomas replied, his tone neither accusatory nor sympathetic, simply stating a fact. "You never asked. In 15 years you have walked past this woman hundreds of times and you never once asked her name, her story, or anything about her life. To you, she was just another servant, as invisible as the furniture." The princess flinched at his words as though she had been physically struck. Margaret watched her struggle with emotions that were clearly unfamiliar, seeing the carefully constructed walls of royal privilege crack and crumble. But Margaret felt no satisfaction in this moment, only a strange emptiness and the beginning of understanding. "My mother never told me," Margaret said quietly, speaking for the first time since the revelation. "She never told me that she saved your life. She came home one day with her arms in casts, and when I asked what happened, she said she had an accident at work. She made me promise never to speak about it to anyone at the palace because she did not want anyone to think she was looking for special treatment or trying to use what happened for her own benefit." Tears were running freely down Princess Isabella's face now, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. She looked younger suddenly, less like an imperious royal and more like a confused young woman, confronting uncomfortable truths about herself. "Your mother died 3 years ago," Captain Thomas said gently to Margaret. "Anne was a good woman. She worked in the palace for 35 years, right up until the illness took her. She never complained, never asked for anything special, and she raised her daughter to have the same work ethic and dignity. The apple did not fall far from the tree." Margaret felt her own eyes filling with tears. She had not cried much when her mother died, too overwhelmed by the practical concerns of supporting her children alone and making sure the funeral was properly done. There had been no time for grief, only survival. But now, standing in this courtyard with sunlight streaming through the windows and the truth finally revealed, she felt the weight of her loss crash over her like a wave. "I miss her every day," Margaret whispered. "She taught me everything. How to work hard, how to keep my dignity no matter what, how to provide for my family. She was so proud when I got a position here at the palace, following in her footsteps. She said this was a good place to work, that the royal family was fair and kind. She made me promise to always do my best and never give them reason to regret hiring me." Princess Isabella covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. The ladies-in-waiting moved forward uncertainly, not sure if they should comfort her or give her space. The younger guard looked deeply uncomfortable, clearly wishing he was anywhere else but here. But Captain Thomas remained steady, his presence somehow grounding everyone in the courtyard. "Your Highness," the captain said after giving the princess a moment to compose herself, "I have served your family faithfully for 23 years. I have never questioned your authority or contradicted your commands. But today, I must speak a truth that you need to hear, even if it is uncomfortable." Princess Isabella lowered her hands and looked at him, her face streaked with tears and makeup. She nodded slowly, giving him permission to continue. "You are not a cruel person," Captain Thomas said. "I have known you since you were born. I have watched you grow from a curious child into a woman, but somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing the people around you as individuals with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dignity. You see only their roles, their functions, their usefulness to you, and that has made you someone your 7-year-old self would not recognize." The princess absorbed his words like blows, each one landing with visible impact. She looked around the courtyard at the guards, at her ladies-in-waiting, at Margaret standing there with her bucket of dirty water and her calloused hands. Perhaps for the first time in years she was really seeing them. "When you were 7, Captain Thomas continued, you used to sneak into the kitchens and sit with the servants during their breaks. You would listen to their stories, ask about their families, help them peel vegetables even though you were a princess and should not be doing such work. Anne used to laugh and say you were the sweetest child she had ever known. She said you had a good heart and would grow up to be a wonderful queen someday. What happened to that little girl, Your Highness?" Princess Isabella's voice was barely audible. "I grew up. I learned what was expected of me. I learned that a princess must maintain proper distance, must command respect, must never show weakness or allow anyone to forget their place. I learned all the rules of being royalty, and somewhere in learning those rules I forgot the more important ones about being human." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Despite everything that had happened, despite the fear and humiliation of the past hour, she found herself feeling something unexpected for the princess standing before her with tears on her face and genuine remorse in her eyes. Not pity exactly, but understanding. The princess had been trapped by her position just as surely as Margaret had been trapped by hers. "Only in different ways, Your Highness," Margaret said softly. "My mother used to tell me that people are not defined by their worst moments, but by what they do after those moments. She said that everyone makes mistakes, but the measure of a person is whether they learn from them or repeat them." The princess looked at Margaret with an expression of wonder, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, until she stood directly in front of the woman she had been ready to destroy just minutes ago. "I am sorry," Princess Isabella said, and the words seemed to cost her everything. "I am sorry for how I spoke to you. I am sorry for not knowing your story, your name, your worth. I am sorry that I have become someone who could treat another human being with such casual cruelty. And I am sorry that I forgot what your mother did for me, forgot to honor her sacrifice by treating her daughter with the respect and gratitude she deserves." Margaret did not know what to say. In all her years at the palace, she had never heard royalty apologize to a servant. It simply did not happen. The social order of the palace, of the entire kingdom, was built on the understanding that some people were above others, and those above did not apologize to those below. Yet here stood Princess Isabella, tears streaming down her face, offering an apology that was clearly genuine and deeply felt. "I accept your apology, Your Highness," Margaret said quietly, "and I am sorry too for speaking above my station. My mother taught me better than that." "No," the princess said firmly, shaking her head. "Do not apologize for speaking truth. Captain Thomas was right. You did not insult me. You simply reminded me that servants are people with their own dignity and challenges. That should not have been a revolutionary statement. But in the world I have created around myself it was. That is my failing, not yours." Captain Thomas cleared his throat gently. "Your Highness, if I may suggest, perhaps this situation could be resolved in a way that honors both your position and the truth that has been revealed today." Princess Isabella wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, trying to regain some of the composure that had been shattered by the revelations of the past hour. She looked at Captain Thomas with an expression that was part gratitude and part curiosity. "What do you suggest, Captain?" she asked, her voice still thick with emotion but steadier now. Captain Thomas glanced at Margaret, then back at the princess. "I suggest that Margaret continue her work here at the palace, but perhaps not scrubbing floors. Her mother Anne was one of the finest workers we ever had, and from what I have observed over the years, Margaret has inherited her mother's strong character and work ethic. We have an opening in the household management office, someone to coordinate the cleaning staff and ensure they have proper supplies and realistic schedules. Margaret would be perfect for that position." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. A position in household management meant better pay, better hours, and most importantly, respect. It meant sitting at a desk instead of kneeling on stone floors. It meant her children would have a better life, more opportunities. But it also felt wrong somehow, like accepting a reward for humiliating the princess. "I cannot accept that," Margaret said quickly, before she could lose her nerve. "Your Highness, Captain Thomas, I appreciate the kindness of this offer, but I will not use what happened today to gain advantages I have not earned. My mother would never approve of that. If I am to advance in my position, I want it to be through my own merit, not because of guilt or obligation." Princess Isabella stared at Margaret as though she was a puzzle that could not be solved. Here was a woman who had every right to be angry, who could have demanded compensation or special treatment, who could have held the past over the princess's head like a sword. Instead, she was refusing an offer that would change her life because she valued her integrity more than her comfort. "You are remarkable," the princess said softly. "You are absolutely remarkable, and I am ashamed that I did not see it before. But I must disagree with you on one point. This offer is not about guilt or obligation. It is about recognizing value that has been overlooked. You have worked here for 15 years, Margaret. 15 years of showing up every day, doing difficult work without complaint, supporting your family alone after your husband died. That is merit. That is exactly the kind of merit that deserves recognition and advancement." Captain Thomas nodded in agreement. "The princess is right. This is not charity, Margaret. We are not offering you this position because of what your mother did 20 years ago. We are offering it because you have earned it through your own actions, your own dedication. What happened today simply opened our eyes to what should have been obvious all along." Margaret felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different tears. Not tears of fear or loss, but tears of something she had almost forgotten existed in her world. Hope. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. That hard work could be rewarded. That dignity could be recognized. That she was not invisible after all. "I do not know what to say," Margaret whispered. "Say yes," Princess Isabella said, and for the first time that morning, she smiled. It was a real smile, not the practiced, polite expression she usually wore for public appearances, but something genuine and warm. "Say yes and help me make this palace a better place. Not just for you, but for all the people who work here. Because Captain Thomas was right about something else. I have stopped seeing the individuals around me. I need people who will remind me to look, to listen, to remember that everyone has a story worth knowing." Margaret looked around the courtyard. The ladies in waiting were watching with expressions that ranged from confusion to admiration. The younger guard had relaxed his rigid posture, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Captain Thomas stood with his arms crossed, looking satisfied like a teacher watching a difficult student finally understand an important lesson. "Yes," Margaret said finally. "Yes, I accept." "Thank you, Your Highness. Thank you, Captain Thomas. I will work hard to prove that your faith in me is not misplaced." "I have no doubt of that," the princess replied. She turned to her ladies in waiting. "Please escort Margaret to the household management office and help her get settled in her new position. Make sure she has everything she needs, and let the staff know that she has my full support and authority in her new role." The ladies in waiting moved forward, their initial skepticism replaced by warmer expressions. They helped Margaret gather her cleaning supplies, speaking to her kindly, asking about her children and her life. The transformation was remarkable. Just an hour ago, Margaret had been invisible to these women. Now they were treating her as an equal, or close to it. As Margaret was being led away, she turned back to look at Princess Isabella one more time. The princess caught her eye and gave a small nod, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. Margaret returned the nod and then followed the ladies in waiting out of the courtyard, leaving behind the bucket of dirty water and the life she had known for 15 years. Captain Thomas and Princess Isabella stood alone in the courtyard now, except for the younger guard who remained at attention near the entrance. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the light streaming through the windows had shifted from golden to white. "Thank you, Captain," the princess said quietly. "Thank you for stopping me from making a terrible mistake. Thank you for reminding me of who I used to be and who I should be." "It is my duty to protect the royal family, Your Highness," Captain Thomas replied. "Sometimes that means protecting you from physical threats. Sometimes it means protecting you from yourselves." Princess Isabella laughed, a genuine laugh that echoed through the courtyard. "You are the only person in this entire palace who would dare say something like that to me." Perhaps that is a problem in itself, the captain observed. When the only person willing to speak truth to you is an old soldier who is too stubborn to care about consequences, it suggests that something is wrong with the system. The princess grew serious again, considering his words. You are right. I have surrounded myself with people who tell me what I want to hear, not what I need to hear. That stops today. I want you to help me reorganize my household staff. I want people around me who will be honest, who will remind me to see beyond titles and roles. Can you do that? I can try, Your Highness, but the real work must come from you. I can bring the right people into your orbit, but you must be willing to listen to them, even when what they say is uncomfortable. I understand, Princess Isabella said. She looked down at the marble columns that had started this entire incident. They gleamed in the sunlight, spotlessly clean, despite the drama that had unfolded around them. I have been so focused on surface appearances, on everything looking perfect, that I forgot to look beneath the surface. I forgot that perfection is not just about clean floors and polished silver. It is about treating people with kindness and respect, about creating an environment where everyone can thrive. Captain Thomas smiled. Your father would be proud to hear you say that. He always believed that the strength of a kingdom comes from the well-being of all its people, not just the wealthy and powerful. I have forgotten many of my father's lessons, the princess admitted. I have been so worried about appearing strong and commanding respect that I became harsh and distant. But strength does not mean cruelty, and respect should be earned through character, not demanded through fear. It is never too late to change, Your Highness. What happened today could be a turning point if you choose to make it one. Princess Isabella nodded slowly. She looked around the courtyard one more time, seeing it differently now. Every column, every stone, every window represented hours of work by people whose names she did not know, whose stories she had never asked about. The palace she lived in, the life of luxury she took for granted, existed because of the labor of hundreds of invisible people who kept everything running smoothly. I want to know their names, she said suddenly. All of them. Every person who works in this palace. I want to know their names, their families, their dreams. I want to remember that they are human beings, not just servants. The news of what happened in the courtyard spread through the palace like wildfire. Servants whispered to each other in hallways, in the kitchens, in the laundry rooms. The story grew with each telling, becoming something close to legend. A lowly cleaning woman had stood up to the princess. Captain Thomas had defended her. The princess had cried and apologized. Margaret had been promoted to a position of authority. Nothing like this had ever happened before in living memory. Some servants were hopeful. Perhaps this meant things would change, that they would be treated better, seen as more than just tools to be used and discarded. Others were skeptical. They had worked in the palace long enough to know that moments of kindness were often fleeting, that the old patterns usually reasserted themselves once the initial emotion faded. Change was difficult, especially in a place as steeped in tradition as the royal palace. Margaret spent her first week in the household management office trying to find her footing. The work was completely different from what she had done for 15 years. Instead of scrubbing and cleaning, she was coordinating schedules, ordering supplies, and addressing concerns from the cleaning staff. It was overwhelming at times, but she approached it with the same dedication she had brought to her previous work. She discovered quickly that the problems she had experienced were not unique to her. The entire cleaning staff was overworked and undersupplied. Budgets had been cut year after year while expectations remained impossibly high. Workers were expected to make ancient mops and worn brushes work miracles, to clean vast spaces in unrealistic time frames. Many of them worked double shifts just to make enough money to support their families. Margaret compiled reports documenting everything she found. She worked late into the evenings, often by candlelight, making sure every fact was accurate and every recommendation was reasonable. She knew that if she wanted lasting change, she needed to present solutions, not just complaints. Her mother had taught her that. Do not just point out problems, Anne used to say. Be part of the solution. After 2 weeks, Margaret requested a meeting with Princess Isabella. She was nervous about it, despite the princess's apparent change of heart. Old habits were hard to break, and Margaret still felt the instinctive fear that came from years of knowing her place in the palace hierarchy. But she pushed past the fear and carried her reports to the princess's private office, a room she had only ever cleaned but never entered as anything other than a servant. Princess Isabella received her warmly. gesturing to a comfortable chair and offering tea. Margaret sat carefully, acutely aware of how different this was from their last encounter. The princess looked different too, more relaxed somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I have been looking forward to your report," the princess said. "Captain Thomas tells me you have been working around the clock since you started your new position." "There's much to document, Your Highness," Margaret replied, setting her papers on the desk between them. "The problems run deeper than I initially realized. It is not just about dirty water in buckets. The entire system needs attention." For the next hour, Margaret presented her findings. She talked about inadequate supplies, unrealistic schedules, insufficient wages, and lack of training. She showed how small investments in better equipment and slightly higher pay would actually save money in the long run by increasing efficiency and reducing the constant turnover of staff. She proposed a complete reorganization of the cleaning schedules, giving workers adequate time to do their jobs properly, instead of rushing through tasks just to meet arbitrary deadlines. Princess Isabella listened without interrupting, taking notes and asking occasional questions. Margaret found herself relaxing as she talked, becoming more animated, more passionate. This was not just about making her own job easier. It was about improving life for all the people who worked behind the scenes to keep the palace functioning. "These are excellent recommendations," the princess said when Margaret finished. "More than excellent. They are exactly what we need. I want you to implement all of them. You have my full authority to make whatever changes are necessary. If anyone questions you or refuses to cooperate, refer them to me directly." Margaret felt relief wash over her. "Thank you, Your Highness. I will not let you down." "I know you will not," the princess replied. "But Margaret, I want you to understand something. This is not just about improving efficiency or saving money, although those are certainly good outcomes. This is about treating people with dignity. It is about recognizing that the people who clean our floors and wash our dishes are human beings who deserve respect and fair treatment. You reminded me of that, and I will not forget it again." Over the following months, changes began to ripple through the palace. New equipment was purchased. Schedules were adjusted. Wages were increased. The cleaning staff noticed the difference immediately, and their work showed it. The palace had always been clean, but now it sparkled in a way it never had before. Workers took pride in their jobs because they felt valued, and that pride showed in everything they did. But the changes went beyond the cleaning staff. Princess Isabella began making a point of learning the names of everyone who worked in the palace. She would stop in hallways to ask about people's families, to inquire about sick children or aging parents. She attended staff celebrations and mourned with them during funerals. At first, people were suspicious, wondering if this was just a temporary performance. But as weeks turned into months, they began to believe that the change was real. Captain Thomas watched it all with quiet satisfaction. He had served the royal family long enough to know that true change was rare and precious. The fact that Princess Isabella had not only listened but actually followed through on her promises was remarkable. He made a point of telling her so one afternoon as they walked through the palace gardens. "You have done well, Your Highness," he said. "Your father would be proud of the leader you are becoming." "I am not there yet," the princess replied honestly. "Some days it is still hard to remember to see past the titles in the hierarchy. I catch myself slipping into old patterns, treating people as functions rather than individuals. But I am trying, and I think that is what matters. Trying and being willing to correct course when I fail. That is all any of us can do," Captain Thomas agreed. "Perfection is impossible, but growth is always possible. You are growing, Your Highness. That is clear to everyone who knows you." The princess smiled, but then her expression grew more serious. "I have been thinking about something, Captain. I want to establish a scholarship program in Anne's name. Something for the children of palace workers, to help them get education and opportunities they might not otherwise have. Anne gave me my life when she caught me that day. The least I can do is help give her grandchildren and others like them a better future." Captain Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That is a beautiful idea, Your Highness. Anne would be honored. Will you help me set it up? I want it to be done properly, not just as a token gesture, but as something meaningful and lasting." "It would be my privilege," the captain replied. The scholarship program was announced 2 months later, at a special ceremony attended by all the palace staff. Margaret stood at the front of the crowd, tears streaming down her face as Princess Isabella spoke about her mother's courage and sacrifice. The princess had commissioned a portrait of Anne to hang in the main hallway of the palace, ensuring that her memory and her story would not be forgotten. Anne was a hero, Princess Isabella told the assembled crowd. Not because she did something extraordinary, although she certainly did that when she saved my life, but because she was ordinary in the best possible way. She showed up every day, did her work with dignity and pride, raised her daughter with love and strong values, and never asked for anything in return. Those are the qualities we should all aspire to, regardless of our position or station. Anne showed me that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. It comes from character, from how we treat others, from the values we live by every single day. 5 years passed and the palace became a different place, not in its physical appearance, which remained as grand and beautiful as ever, but in its spirit. The changes that began on that fateful morning in the courtyard had taken root and grown into something larger than anyone could have anticipated. Margaret had become one of the most respected members of the palace staff. Her department ran with efficiency and compassion, setting a standard that other departments began to emulate. She had hired several new staff members, always making sure to look past surface appearances and see the potential in people who reminded her of herself 5 years ago. People who worked hard despite difficult circumstances, who showed up every day with dignity, even when life knocked them down. Her children had both received scholarships from the Anne Memorial Education Fund, as it was officially called. Her daughter was studying medicine at the university, and her son was apprenticing with a master craftsman in the city. Margaret's heart swelled with pride every time she thought about them. They would have opportunities she never had, chances to build lives beyond scrubbing floors and struggling to pay rent. That was Anne's legacy, carried forward through her daughter and grandchildren. Princess Isabella had grown into her role in ways that surprised even those closest to her. The sharp-tongued, impatient young woman who had once dismissed an entire person's worth in a single cruel sentence had become known throughout the kingdom as a fair and compassionate leader. She had expanded the scholarship program to include children from families throughout the capital city, not just palace workers. She had reformed labor practices across all royal properties, ensuring fair wages and reasonable working conditions. But perhaps her most significant change was in how she carried herself day to day. She no longer swept through hallways expecting people to scatter before her like leaves before a storm. Instead, she walked with purpose but also with awareness, stopping to greet people by name, asking genuine questions about their lives, remembering details from previous conversations. The palace staff no longer feared her. They respected her, which was far more valuable. One spring morning, Princess Isabella stood in the courtyard, where everything had changed 5 years before. The marble columns gleamed in the sunlight, cleaned by a well-trained staff with proper supplies and adequate time. She had come here to think, to remember, to measure how far she had come. Captain Thomas found her there, as he often did when she needed someone to talk to. He was older now, the gray in his hair having turned to silver, but he remained as sharp and perceptive as ever. He had trained the younger guard who had witnessed that long-ago confrontation to take over most of his daily duties, but he still came to the palace regularly to advise the princess on matters that required wisdom and experience. "Remembering that day?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "How could I forget?" Princess Isabella replied. "It was the day I stopped being a spoiled, entitled princess and started becoming the person I should have been all along. The person my father raised me to be before I lost my way." "You were not entirely spoiled," Captain Thomas said with a slight smile. "Just somewhat lost, as you said. It happens to many young people, especially those born into privilege. The world tells you that your position makes you special, superior, deserving of deference. It takes wisdom to see through that lie and recognize that we are all just human beings trying to do our best." "I almost destroyed a woman's life that day," the princess said quietly. "If you had not been there, if you had not had the courage to speak truth to power, I would have sent Margaret away in disgrace. I would have taken away her livelihood, blacklisted her from ever working in a royal household again, all because my pride was wounded by honest words. That kind of casual cruelty horrifies me now." "But you did not do those things," Captain Thomas reminded her. "You listened, you learned, and you changed. That is what matters." "We all make mistakes, Your Highness. The measure of our character is not whether we stumble, but whether we get back up and choose a better path." Princess Isabella smiled at him. "You sound like Margaret's mother." Anne used to say something very similar, according to Margaret. about people being defined not by their worst moments but by what they do after. Anne was a wise woman, the captain agreed. I wish you could have known her as an adult, not just as the child she saved. She would have been proud to see what you have become. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Princess Isabella spoke again. I have been offered a position on the kingdom's council, she said. They want me to oversee labor reform across all royal territories, not just palace properties. It is a significant responsibility, and it would mean traveling extensively, meeting with workers and employers, mediating disputes, creating new policies. I am considering accepting. You should accept, Captain Thomas said without hesitation. This is exactly the kind of work you were meant to do. You have proven here in the palace that meaningful change is possible when leaders care about the well-being of all people, not just the wealthy and powerful. The kingdom needs that perspective on the council. But who will manage things here if I am gone so much? The princess asked. The palace has excellent staff now thanks largely to your reforms. It will run smoothly even without your constant presence. And you have Margaret. She is more than capable of handling day-to-day operations. Trust the people you have empowered, Your Highness. That is also part of good leadership. Princess Isabella nodded slowly. You are right, of course. I have spent 5 years learning to trust people, learning to see their potential and give them opportunities to shine. It would be hypocritical to hoard all the responsibility and control instead of delegating to those who have earned it. Then it is settled, Captain Thomas said. You will accept the position and continue the work you started here on a much larger scale. The kingdom will be better for it. That afternoon, Princess Isabella called Margaret to her office once more. The nervousness that had characterized their early meetings was long gone, replaced by a comfortable working relationship built on mutual respect. They were not exactly friends. The gap in their stations was still too wide for that, but they had become something more valuable than friends. They were partners in the work of making the palace, and by extension the kingdom, a more just and equitable place. I have some news, the princess told Margaret. I have been offered a position on the kingdom's council, and I have decided to accept. It will mean I am away from the palace frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time. I need to know that things will continue to run smoothly in my absence, and there is only one person I trust with that responsibility. Margaret felt her heart begin to race. Your Highness, I am honored by your confidence, but surely there are others more qualified, people with more education and experience with administrative matters. There are people with more formal education, the princess agreed, but education is not the same as wisdom, and degrees do not guarantee good character. You have both wisdom and character, Margaret. You have proven that over and over again. More importantly, you understand what these reforms are really about. You have lived the reality of being invisible, of being treated as less than human simply because of your position. That perspective is invaluable, and I trust you to maintain the standards we have worked so hard to establish. Margaret felt tears prickling her eyes. Even after 5 years, moments like this still moved her deeply. To be seen, to be valued, to be trusted with important responsibility, these things never stopped feeling like small miracles. I will do my best, Margaret said. I promise you that. I know you will, Princess Isabella replied. Just as your mother did her best, just as you have always done your best. That is all anyone can ask. The years continued to pass. Princess Isabella's work on the council brought sweeping reforms to labor practices throughout the kingdom. Wages increased, working conditions improved, and workers gained rights and protections they had never had before. There was resistance from some of the wealthy employers who profited from the old system, but the princess was relentless and surprisingly skilled at political maneuvering. She had learned to use her position and privilege not to maintain the status quo, but to challenge it. Margaret continued to manage the palace with skill and compassion. She became a mentor to younger workers, helping them navigate the complexities of palace life while maintaining their dignity and sense of self-worth. She told them stories about her mother, about Anne's courage and quiet strength, ensuring that the lessons of the past were not forgotten by the next generation. On the 10th anniversary of that fateful day in the courtyard, the palace held a celebration. Workers from all departments gathered in the Great Hall, joined by representatives from worker organizations across the kingdom. Princess Isabella gave a speech reflecting on how far they had all come. 10 years ago, she said, her voice carrying through the hall, I was someone I am not proud of. I was blind to the humanity of the people around me, deaf to their struggles, callous in my exercise of privilege and power. It took a brave woman named Margaret and a courageous captain named Thomas to hold up a mirror and force me to see what I had become. I will be forever grateful to them for that gift.